Armed officers flood the room, their movements precise, their voices sharp. Officer, commanding. Elijah Brooks. Step away from the desk. Hands where we can see them. Elijah exhales slowly, his expression unreadable. He doesn't react with shock, anger, or even confusion. Officer, firmly. You are under arrest for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit corporate theft. Stand up and turn around. Across the room, Richard Lawson stands with a carefully crafted expression of mock disappointment. He steps forward, shaking his head, as if betrayed. Richard, with feigned disbelief. Elijah, after everything we built? How could you? The officers begin leading Elijah toward the door, his movements controlled, deliberate. As they pass Richard, Elijah finally speaks, his voice measured, devoid of emotion. Elijah. You'll regret this. Richard smirks slightly but quickly masks it, turning to the officers. Richard. Get him out of here. To the world, it seemed like a billionaire had finally been caught in his own web of lies. But the real mastermind is yet to be revealed. The courtroom is packed. Rows of spectators, reporters, and legal experts whisper among themselves. The air is thick with tension. At the front, the judge sits tall, her gavel resting within reach. The jury watches silently. The case has the whole city's attention. Elijah Brooks sits at the defense table, hands folded. He hasn't spoken a word since his arrest. His expression is unreadable. Next to him, his lawyer flips through documents, whispering last-minute strategies. Across the room, Richard Lawson sits with his own legal team. He leans back in his chair, confidence radiating from him. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking man in a gray suit, steps forward. Prosecutor, addressing the court. Your Honor, the evidence against Mr. Brooks is overwhelming. What we have here is a clear case of corporate fraud at the highest level. He pauses, pacing. Then he gestures toward the screen behind him. Prosecutor. The bank records. The falsified transactions. The missing millions. All of it leads back to one man. The screen lights up, showing spreadsheets, email exchanges, and financial reports. Transactions linked directly to Elijah's company accounts flash on display. The jury murmurs among themselves. Elijah remains still. No reaction. No protest. Just watching. Richard glances at him, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. The prosecutor continues. Prosecutor. We have testimony from financial analysts confirming these fraudulent activities. We have emails, signed by Mr. Brooks himself, authorizing the illegal transfers. He turns to the jury. Prosecutor. The prosecution asks for nothing but justice. Justice for the investors, for the employees, and for the people who trusted this man. The judge nods. Judge. Does the defense wish to make an opening statement? Elijah's lawyer stands, buttoning his suit. Defense lawyer. We do, Your Honor. But not yet. A ripple of surprise moves through the courtroom. Richard smirks. He thinks this is already over. Vanessa sits in the gallery, watching Elijah closely. Shadow, the K9, rests at her feet. The dog is alert, eyes fixed on Richard. A quiet growl rumbles from its throat. Richard notices and shifts slightly in his seat. Elijah finally speaks, his voice low but steady. Elijah. Let them finish their case. Then, I'll speak. Silence. Richard frowns for the first time. 3 months earlier. A high-end restaurant buzzes with quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses. Soft jazz plays in the background. The lighting is warm, casting a golden glow over polished tables and crisp white linens. In a private booth near the back, Richard Lawson leans forward, his eyes locked on Vanessa. She stirs her wine absent-mindedly, avoiding his gaze. Richard, lowering his voice. You're closer to Elijah than anyone. He trusts you. Vanessa shifts in her seat. She forces a small smile, but her fingers tighten around her glass. Vanessa. And? Richard. And that means you're the only one who can help me. She exhales, pretending to consider. Vanessa. You mean betray him? Richard smirks. Richard. Help him see reason. She scoffs, taking a slow sip of wine. Vanessa. And what exactly do you need? Richard slides a small flash drive across the table. Richard. Bank records. Passwords. Any financial details you can get your hands on. She stares at the drive but doesn't touch it. Vanessa. And what do I get out of this? Richard leans in, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard. A stake in the company once Elijah's out of the way. More money than you can imagine. Vanessa twirls the stem of her glass between her fingers, her expression unreadable. Vanessa. And Elijah? Richard tilts his head, pretending to think. Richard. Well, prison changes people. She looks up, finally meeting his eyes. Vanessa. I'll think about it. Richard grins, sensing victory. But as Vanessa picks up the flash drive, her other hand rests subtly on her phone under the table, recording every word. Across the restaurant, a familiar set of eyes watches from a darkened corner. Elijah. Silent. Observing. His fingers tap lightly against his glass, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Richard thinks he's setting up Elijah. But Elijah has already begun setting up Richard. A dimly lit parking garage hums with the low rumble of passing cars above. The air smells of oil and damp concrete. Near a row of parked vehicles, Richard Lawson stands with his hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the area. Footsteps echo. A man steps from the shadows, a detective in a worn leather jacket, badge barely visible on his belt. His name is Detective Harris, and his smirk tells Richard everything he needs to know. Detective Harris, grinning. You really went all out for this one, Lawson. Richard smirks back, pulling a thick envelope from his coat and tossing it to Harris. Richard. Elijah Brooks is a careful man. Too careful. I need him buried in evidence. Not just accused, convicted. Harris flips through the envelope, cash, neat stacks of it. He nods, satisfied. Detective Harris. Then you'll love what I put together. He pulls out a folder, handing it to Richard. Inside are carefully fabricated documents, altered bank statements, email correspondences, and transaction records. Detective Harris, chuckling. These emails? They'll look like Elijah was orchestrating everything. And the offshore accounts? The money will point straight to him. Richard schemes through the papers, nodding approvingly. Richard. And the witnesses? Harris leans against a car, crossing his arms. Detective Harris. Got a few people who'll say whatever you need for the right price. A former employee, an anonymous whistleblower, the usual. Richard grins. This is it. Everything is falling into place. Richard. Good. Once this is in the right hands, Elijah will have no way out. Harris extends his hand. Detective Harris. Pleasure doing business with you. Richard shakes it, sealing the deal. What neither of them notices is a tiny, glinting camera lens, embedded in the collar of Harris's jacket. A K9 mounted body cam, recording everything from a distance. And somewhere, watching the live feed, Elijah Brooks simply smiles. A penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlook the glittering city skyline, but Vanessa isn't admiring the view. She stands near the edge of the room, arms crossed. Her body is tense. Across from her, Richard pours himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Richard, smirking. You seem nervous, Vanessa. Having second thoughts. Vanessa exhales, forcing a small smile. Vanessa. I've done everything you asked. Bank records. Access codes. I gave you everything. Richard takes a slow sip, watching her. Richard. And yet, something feels off. He walks toward her, closing the distance. She holds her ground. Richard, lowering his voice. You're not getting attached, are you? To Elijah. Vanessa lets out a small laugh, but it's hollow. Vanessa. Why would I? I know what this is. I help you, and we both win. Richard studies her for a moment, then steps even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Richard. There's another way you could win more. Vanessa tenses. Richard. Forget Elijah. Be with me. His fingers brush a strand of hair from her face. She forces herself not to react. Vanessa. You're joking. Richard, smirking. Am I? I could give you everything. Money. Power. Security. All you have to do is say yes. His hand trails down her arm, but before he can go any further, a low, menacing growl fills the room. Richard freezes. Slowly, he turns his head. Shadow, the K9, stands near the doorway, teeth bared. The dog's eyes burn with quiet fury, locked onto Richard. Vanessa smiles, stepping back. Vanessa. He doesn't like you very much. Richard forces a chuckle, but there's tension in his jaw. Richard. It's just a dog. Vanessa kneels beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears. Vanessa, softly. No. He's family. She stands and picks up her bag. Vanessa. I'll be in touch. She walks toward the door, but before stepping out, she glances back. Shadow is still staring at Richard. And Richard, for the first time, looks uneasy. A cold, gray morning. The city skyline is blurred by steady rainfall. Inside Elijah's sleek, modern office, everything is in its place, framed awards, polished desks, and neatly stacked files. A sanctuary of order. But today, that order is about to be shattered. The front doors burst open. A dozen officers storm in, their boots thudding against the marble floors. Their voices boom through the office. Lead officer. Elijah Brooks, you are under investigation for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Hands where we can see them. Employees freeze at their desks. Some gasp. Others exchange stunned looks. Elijah, seated at his desk, doesn't move. His fingers remain laced together, resting calmly on the polished surface. His expression? Completely unreadable. Richard Lawson steps in behind the officers, an exaggerated look of disappointment on his face. Richard, shaking his head. Elijah. I never wanted it to come to this. The officers begin ransacking the office. File cabinets are pulled open. Hard drives are confiscated. One officer holds up a manila folder, flipping through the pages. Officer. These transaction records match the offshore accounts. Another officer pulls up Elijah's emails on a confiscated laptop. Officer 2. We have messages confirming wire transfers. This is solid evidence. Richard sighs, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder in fake sympathy. Richard. You could have just been honest with me. We were supposed to be partners. Elijah finally looks up. His gaze meets Richard's, steady and unmoving. Then, without a word, he extends his wrists. The lead officer steps forward, snapping handcuffs around them. The metallic click echoes through the room. Lead officer. You're coming with us. As they lead Elijah away, Shadow, his loyal K9, lets out a low growl from the corner of the office. He watches the entire scene, his ears twitching, his dark eyes locked onto Richard. Richard smirks, adjusting his cufflinks. To him, this is checkmate. But as Elijah steps into the elevator, his reflection in the glass shows something different. A ghost of a smile. Because in reality, the game has only just begun. The grand courtroom is silent, thick with tension. The heavy wooden doors have long since closed, sealing in the drama unfolding inside. The prosecution has presented its case. The evidence is stacked against Elijah Brooks. Richard sits in the front row, legs crossed, his smirk barely hidden. Vanessa sits behind him, expression unreadable. The jury watches Elijah closely, waiting for him to speak. But he doesn't. Not yet. The prosecutor steps forward, adjusting his tie. Prosecutor, confidently. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Brooks's fraudulent transactions are well documented. His emails detail his plans to funnel millions into offshore accounts. He gestures toward the large screen displaying records of supposed transactions, email chains, and signed documents. Prosecutor. We even have witness testimony from trusted sources who can confirm his involvement. The jury murmurs. Some nod. The judge steeples his fingers, watching Elijah closely. Judge. Mr. Brooks, do you have anything to say in your defense? Elijah remains still. His expression is unreadable. Then, slowly, he glances at his attorney, giving a small nod. The attorney stands. Elijah's attorney. Your Honor, if we may, we have one final piece of evidence to present. Richard shifts in his seat, eyes narrowing. Judge. Proceed. A video file is loaded onto the screen. At first, it's just static. Then, the footage begins. It's grainy at first, then sharpens into clarity. A familiar scene appears, Richard in a dimly lit parking garage, exchanging a thick envelope with Detective Harris. The courtroom leans in. Richard, on screen, laughing. Elijah's downfall is set in motion. He'll have no way out. Gasps ripple through the audience. Richard stiffens in his seat. The prosecutor turns pale. The footage continues. Clips of Vanessa handing over financial records. A voice recording of Richard instructing the detective to plant evidence. And then. A final clip. Richard standing too close to Vanessa, his voice low and menacing. Richard, on screen, whispering. Forget Elijah. Marry me, and you'll have everything. T21. The courtroom erupts. Reporters scramble to write notes. The judge bangs his gavel for order. Elijah finally speaks. Elijah, calmly. Your Honor, the truth was never in the emails. It was never in the documents. He turns to look at Shadow, sitting alert beside him. Elijah. It was always in the loyalty that Richard underestimated. Shadow lets out a single, sharp bark. Richard turns pale. And just like that. The case has flipped. The courtroom is a storm of whispers and tension. The shocking video footage replays in everyone's minds, Richard's words, his threats, his arrogance laid bare for the world to see. The prosecution looks shaken. The jury's expressions have shifted from certainty to doubt, and now, to something even stronger. Anger. Richard, for the first time, isn't smirking. His hands grip the arms of his chair, knuckles turning white. His lawyer leans over, whispering urgently, but Richard isn't listening. His gaze is locked on Elijah, who sits calm and still, as if he knew this moment would come. Judge, sternly. Mr. Lawson, do you wish to respond to the evidence presented? Richard stands abruptly, straightening his expensive suit. He forces a chuckle, shaking his head. Richard. This is absurd, Your Honor. That video, it's been edited, manipulated. My business partner is a fraud, and now he's trying to frame me. Elijah's attorney doesn't even look concerned. Instead, he nods to a technician at the side of the room. Elijah's attorney. Your Honor, to ensure authenticity, this footage was retrieved from a verified, unaltered body cam source. A new image appears on the screen. The courtroom watches as the body cam footage from Shadow, the K9, begins to play. The video shows Shadow following Vanessa into meetings with Richard, standing guard as Richard cornered her, recording everything with the tiny camera attached to his harness. The final clip plays. Richard's voice, low and venomous. Richard, on screen, growling. Elijah's finished. You either come with me, or I'll make sure you regret it. A murmur spreads through the courtroom. The judge leans forward, eyes narrowing. Judge. Mr. Lawson, do you deny the authenticity of this footage? Richard swallows. His jaw tightens. Richard, muttering. I. Before he can finish, a new voice cuts through the courtroom. Jury foreperson. Your Honor, we have reached a verdict. The room holds its breath. The judge nods. Judge. Proceed. The jury foreperson stands, unfolding a slip of paper. Jury foreperson. In the case of the state versus Elijah Brooks, we find the defendant, Elijah Brooks, not guilty. A pause. Then, an uproar. Applause. Gasps. Relief. But the verdict isn't done. The foreperson clears their throat. Jury foreperson. In the matter of Mr. Richard Lawson, we recommend an immediate investigation into perjury, fraud, and conspiracy to commit a crime. Richard's breath catches. He whips around to his lawyer, but there's nothing they can do. The judge's gavel slams down. Judge. Mr. Lawson, you are hereby placed under arrest pending further investigation. Two officers step forward, grabbing Richard by the arms. Richard, furious, shouting. You set me up. This isn't over, Elijah. Elijah watches, his face still calm. As Richard is dragged past him, their eyes meet. Elijah, softly. Oh, it's over. Richard struggles, but it's useless. And as he's led away in handcuffs, it's clear. The hunter has become the prey. The chaos in the courtroom fades as Richard is escorted out in handcuffs, his face twisted in shock and fury. Reporters rush to capture the moment, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward him. But Richard has no words. For the first time, he's speechless. Elijah steps outside the courthouse, the weight of months of deception and planning finally lifting. Vanessa walks beside him, her posture tense, but her expression unreadable. Shadow trots next to them, his eyes sharp and alert. Elijah reaches into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his fingers brushing against something smooth and familiar, his pillow pen. It wasn't just any pen. It was sleek, expensive, and weighted perfectly to rest in his palm, a symbol of power and precision. But more than that, it was a reminder. His father had given it to him years ago. In business, in life, always write your own fate, he had said. And that's exactly what Elijah had done. He twirls the pen slowly between his fingers as he watches Richard struggle against the officers holding him. A slow, knowing smirk crosses Elijah's face as Richard locks eyes with him. Richard, furious, seething. You set me up. Elijah doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he clicks the pen open and closed, the soft snick of the mechanism filling the brief silence. Then, he speaks. Elijah, calm, deliberate. Some betrayals are designed to fail. And some games? They were never yours to win. Richard blinks. Confusion flickers behind his anger. Then, realization dawns. Vanessa tilts her head, her lips curling into something between amusement and victory. Vanessa. You really thought you were the one in control, didn't you? Elijah lifts the pen, rolling it between his fingers. Elijah. Everything you thought was your plan. It was ours first. Richard's breathing quickens. He looks between them, his mind racing, piecing together everything that had just happened. The evidence. The courtroom reveal. The flawless way Elijah had stayed silent, watching, waiting. The way Vanessa had given him just enough trust to keep him believing she was on his side. And the K9. Shadow. His blood runs cold as he remembers the tiny, almost insignificant camera mounted on Shadow's collar. The footage had been the final nail in his coffin. Elijah taps the pen against his palm. Elijah. I told you once, Richard. I don't sign deals that don't benefit me. Richard stumbles back, his pride cracking into something raw and exposed. Richard, whispering, disbelieving. No. No, this isn't possible. Vanessa chuckles softly, folding her arms. Vanessa. Possible? Richard, this was inevitable. Elijah straightens his suit jacket, then tucks the pen back into his pocket with a final snick. Elijah, softly. Checkmate. Richard thrashes as the officers push him into the police vehicle. His shouts are drowned out by the slamming door. Elijah and Vanessa exchange a glance. Shadow barks once, almost as if in approval. Justice had been served. But the real game? It had been won long before the trial even began. Elijah watches as the police vehicle pulls away, the flashing lights fading into the distance. The crowd of reporters slowly disperses, their attention shifting to their phones, already writing the headlines that will dominate the news cycle. Vanessa stands beside him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Shadow sits between them, ears perked, his gaze locked in the direction Richard was taken. Elijah sighs, reaching into his jacket pocket once more. His fingers brush over the pillow pen, and he pulls it out, rolling it between his fingers. A habit. A reminder. A signature to a game well played. Vanessa, quietly. It's over. Elijah exhales through his nose, a slow nod following. Elijah. It had to end this way. Vanessa shifts, glancing at him. Vanessa. You knew he would try to take everything from you. Elijah clicks the pen once. Elijah. That was his mistake. He thought I was playing defense. She watches him, then smirks, shaking her head. Vanessa. You let him think he had the upper hand the whole time. Elijah finally looks at her, his expression calm, unreadable. Elijah. I needed him to believe it. If he knew I was ahead, he would have changed the game. Vanessa's gaze lingers on him for a moment, then shifts to Shadow. She crouches down, rubbing the dog's head gently. Vanessa, softly. He really saved us, didn't he? Shadow wags his tail, nudging his head into her palm. Elijah. More than he'll ever know. Elijah kneels beside them, resting a hand on Shadow's back. The dog leans into him, warm and steady. He had always been more than just protection. He was a witness. A guardian. And in the end, the single most important player in the game. Vanessa watches Elijah carefully. Vanessa. So what now? Elijah exhales, standing up slowly, adjusting his cuffs. He clicks the pen one last time before tucking it away. Elijah. Now. We move forward. We write the next chapter. Vanessa nods, a small smile forming. Vanessa. Together. Elijah meets her eyes. A slow, knowing smirk crosses his lips. Elijah. Always. He reaches for Shadow's leash, giving it a light tug. Elijah, to the dog. Come on, boy. Let's go home. Shadow barks once, falling into step beside them. Vanessa walks on the other side, the three of them moving forward into the city streets. The past was over. The betrayal was behind them. And the future? That was theirs to write.